Welcome to After Collapse, the Key Concepts series. I'm Max Borders. I'm your host, and I'm also author of the book After Collapse. I hope, of course, you'll pick up the book, but let's get into some of the key concepts right now. Here are two that begin with P, the two Ps. And these are fancy words, polycentricity and polyarchy. So what is polycentricity? Okay, if we're talking about the way we organize ourselves as human beings, we have to talk about centers of power or authority. And polycentricity just means many centers. That means there's not one gigantic center of power, but instead smaller centers of power distribution or authority or decision-making authority or whatever. So that refers in this context to centers of power and authority and describes specifically in the book a non-monopolistic form of law. So if you think of it simply like this, the state governments in the United States are polycentric, to some degree. We also have in each state counties and county governments, and they're responsible for certain things. And the question is the degree to which each of these centers of power to what degree they have power. And is that power more localized or is it more centralized? Now, everyone knows that the United States federal government is quite powerful, but at least we can describe these centers of power that are non-monopolistic. If you're not happy, for example, in California, you can move to Texas. In fact, many people are. I live in Texas. So these decentralized jurisdictions are really a way of talking about offering something besides a monolithic jurisdiction or a monolithic set of laws. So why is polycentricity a good thing? Well, here we see Elinor and Vincent Ostrom, who were one of the, these guys really did a lot of work in studying this stuff. Also, there's Tom W. Bell, who's working both as a scholar and in architecting legal frameworks for new polycentric orders. So we have bad rules in one jurisdiction means that it doesn't have to be catastrophic. So, for example, if the state of Illinois wants to, for lack of a better way of putting it, screw itself, then people can move out of Illinois into other states with more stable institutions and lower taxes or whatever it is in that jurisdiction that you prefer. So this means that if you have multiple jurisdictions, it's easier to find something else. It's easier to vote with your feet or vote with your boat if you're going across the ocean. So this idea of multiple options for voting with your feet mean that you reduce the cost of exit. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy to get out of your country, as in East Germany back in the old days, but still the idea of reducing exit costs means that there are greater options, and it's more or less easier to find something new that's closer to your conception of the good or good institutions. So the other part of polycentricity that's good is that good rules can be copied. If you see something good in another country or in another state, you can try to enact those rules in your own jurisdiction and benefit from the blessings of those good rules. And finally, you get jurisdictional arbitrage or competition between jurisdictions. If you don't like what's going on in one state, again, California is seeing an exodus of people because California's institutions are problematic to a lot of people, and it's become very expensive to live there, and so people are coming here, particularly from the Bay Area to Austin, Texas, where I live. So this is an example of jurisdictional arbitrage. If you don't like the institutions and they're not benefiting you somewhere, you move somewhere else. Polycentricity offers this. Bad law gets selected out, at least theoretically. Now, I say theoretically because what we're finding is that due to the dynamics of public choice and special interest, it's very hard to get laws to change once they're enacted because you get special interest capture around them. So bad law being selected out has to happen in other ways, and hopefully not due to catastrophe. So how do we achieve a polycentric order? How do we achieve these multiple jurisdictions that somehow hang together for a people? Well, one way is conquest, although That's pretty old school and pretty violent. We're not really about violence in this book. And After Collapse is one of the through lines of the book is nonviolence. So we like to mitigate the amount of violence in the world, and we don't think conquest is a terribly good way to bring about polycentrism. Colonization is another way, and that too has a checkered history for reasons I don't really need to go into here. You can do comparative colonies. The French colonies of sub-Saharan Africa are examples of bad, or Northern Africa are examples of not so good colonization, or at least the institutions they left aren't that great. Code Civil is not wonderful, in my opinion. But Hong Kong benefited after the Opium Wars from the common law and from good legal institutions that made it one of the most resplendent gems in all the world as a city-state. Still, we'd like not to use colonization as a mechanism for polycentricity. How about constitutions? Well, there's a great example recently out of Honduras where they changed their constitution to allow for special economic zones. And we can talk about this more in a moment. I portend in the book After Collapse, obviously, that there could be a collapse scenario for the United States. In fact, it looks very likely to me. And my hope is that after collapse, we see the emergence of a different kind of order that is more polycentric. But I don't think that we ought to hasten collapse as a means to that. A lot of people would get hurt in the process. My preference is we would get out in front of it and change the institutions through some other means that are less destructive than just seeing to collapse. So what about code? And I don't mean legal code, although that's also true. I'm talking about computer code. So you'll notice I have Bitcoin in the background there. And Bitcoin is an example, by the way, of a kind of code as law, where the coders were actually creating a different system through the legal code that could be opted into. This is a way of choosing law, in a sense, in a permissionless way. So they didn't have to count on a third party or a legislature to adopt Bitcoin or to create it. Instead, it was something that was offered to people, and they preferred it to the dollar's matrix, the dollar regime, and they opted into it. And Bitcoin continues to grow and gather steam every day. It's not perfect. It has its flaws. Other people think there are other cryptocurrencies that are better. Nevertheless, you get the idea. And this leads me to the idea of polyarchy. And I put the Ethereum symbol, and I could have put the Cardano symbol or any other blockchain, Polkadot, there for a reason, because polyarchy, which was conceived by this funny-looking fellow, Paul-Émile du Puydt, who was a Belgian philosopher about the mid-1850s, or mid-1800s rather. Du Puydt basically asks the question, why can't we just choose the system of government we want? Why can't we just opt into it? And then if there are any kinds of problems or conflicts between those systems of governance, we can just go to the courts to get them settled. This is a really interesting idea. With the advent of cryptocurrencies and distributed ledgers, it makes this even more of a plausible idea. So in this case, you get something that looks like a real social contract. You'll notice that throughout most of intellectual history, we get this idea of a social contract to justify certain kinds of governments. But why not real social contracts? Why can't you opt into a governance situation, pay for the benefit of doing so, and have it be sort of like business in government? And in this way, we can conceive of polyarchy through cloud governance. That is to say, you can at least opt in to cryptographically protected relationships in the cloud, using cryptocurrencies, using these kinds of distributed ledger technologies, mutual aid, and so on. And we're in the nascency of a movement that gives humanity the ability to do that, where it'll be less about this sort of arbitrariness of birth through conquered territory and more about governance frameworks that we choose and test and become tested in an evolutionary fitness landscape. So again, we have this idea of code as law. And remember, at least with code as law, the code can be forked. And that's a really important thing, because if there's a slight variation and you want to try out, invite people into your system, you can fork the code, as it were. And we've seen that with some of the cryptocurrencies already. So the idea of forking the code means there are greater opportunities to reduce the cost of exit for a system that isn't working for you and invite you into a system that does. So here we have Puydt describing this, and I think it's really an interesting idea for decentralization. He really says that it's about this panacea for him is simply about letting people choose their own government. Okay? And this will yield a contest between governmental forms where you put your best foot forward and people can choose you or not. This is called, in modern parlance, competitive governance. And what's interesting from Puyt's standpoint is you can choose anarchy, autocracy, oligarchy, all these different forms, Democrat, Republican, Tory, liberal party, whatever you like and whatever your country is, choose those systems, opt into them, live under their auspices, and if they don't work out for you, you can leave. But what's interesting about it is you never have to leave your dressing gown or slippers, says Puyt. And that's really brings us to this idea, the potential for distributed ledgers for creating these kinds of new systems. The old order governments don't like it, and that brings us to two problems of authority. The first problem of authority, according to, for example, Michael Huemer, who's written a great book on this, is that authority is not justified. It's really difficult to justify one human being lording power over another for any reason. And what those reasons are usually don't measure up to the idea of human dignity. As long as you're not hurting someone else, why should someone be able to lord their authority over you? So the first problem of authority is really hard to justify. We live in this sort of civic mythology of justification for it. You know, I venerate the Constitution, or at least the original meaning of the Constitution, and yet it gives certain people authority over me. The second big problem of authority, however, is even bigger. And that is simply the fact that authority does not give a flying shit about your desire to self-organize or to exit a system of government. In fact, they're almost always at odds with it. So what do we do? Okay. Given these different forms of technological means, these digital ledgers, and so on, we're starting to see with cryptography the ability to build cloud jurisdictions, which is to say we can opt into systems even though we're still living in these old conquest-based jurisdictions. We can form DISCs, which is my term, an acronym for Distributed Income Support Cooperatives. This is just mutual aid with technological means. You know, back in the turn of the 20th, 19th, and 20th centuries, we had mutual aid societies. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans was a member of one of these societies, and this was what ordinary people did to weave their own social safety nets. Of course, with the rise of the welfare state, the mutual aid societies went away, and people became dependent on state monopolies for their welfare. I believe that private cities are also on the horizon. We're already seeing, I was going to tell you about Prospera, which is in Roatan, an island off the coast of Honduras, for an economic zone or a public-private partnership where power is distributed and there is very much this view to providing certain kinds of legal services in a way that comports with the needs of the people there. And this private city model means that they have to abide by their side of the contract. There's no abstract social contract with a government that has sovereign immunity. You really have to come through for your people in these models. And I think this is a beautiful development in governance. We can start to turn our entrepreneurial lenses on things that we thought were immune to entrepreneurship, things like governance. And finally, there's seasteading. These seastead platforms are becoming technologically feasible so that people can live either 12 miles or 24 nautical miles off the coast of these individual societies if they can find an opportunity to experiment or to engage in some sort of jurisdictional arbitrage. We may start to see the development of these seasteading colonies or zones off the coast of these great powers. And this allows for greater experimentation, greater forms of self-organization that don't get captured by special interests or captured in some sort of mythic amber in our minds. The idea here, basically, with polycentricity and polyarchy is simply this: experiments in governance, where you have to serve your customers to do better. However we can get it, it's probably for the good. And of course, another example is e-citizenship from Estonia, where you can incorporate in Estonia and not actually live there if you want to escape the crappy laws of your jurisdiction. So there we have it, folks. If you like these ideas and you want to learn more about this stuff, I encourage you to pick up The Social Singularity, which is my first decentralist manifesto. I think you'll love it. Or my latest book, After Collapse. And these are some of the core concepts in that book. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.